If AMD have ever had an opportunity to take back market share from Nvidia, then now is definitely the time. With the recent announcement of the RTX 4080 and 4080 and 4090 from Nvidia, everyone noticed that there was a massive price hike on the 80 series cards. Now, they did do a very odd move, in my opinion, with the RTX 4090, in that they raised the price less than the actual CPI inflation numbers, but they also made it, dare I say, the best looking value card on the stack versus these other two lower tier models. However, my biggest disappointment with Nvidia with this launch was how they named the RTX 4080 12GB. From doing more research, this is actually a different piece of silicon than the RTX 4080 16GB, meaning it's a smaller die, and not just is it cut down from 16GB of VRAM to 12GB of VRAM, but it's also going to have less CUDA cores, and in turn, it's got a smaller memory bus at 192-bit wide, and this is going to translate for the end gamer a lot less performance than you would expect having two series of graphics cards released with the same model. However, after doing my research, I have noticed that there is a new trend that's going to take place in PC gaming. We'll talk about that now, and we'll also talk about if AMD wants to take the strategy that I think they should given the economic environment, and how it could mean that they could get back into the game. Let's discuss. Welcome back to Tech Yes City and the RTX 4080 12GB, aka I'm calling it the RTX 4070, where it's coming in at $899. That's a starting from price. So basically, if we compare this to, say, the RTX 3070 or the RTX 2070 before that, they were $499 cards. Also, there was the RTX 3070 Ti, which traditionally that would have came in at the same price at $499, being released later in the cycle as sort of a refresh on their current branded cards. However, that went up to $599. So during these last 2 years, inflation has really crept up on Nvidia, AMD, and Intel. And my biggest critiquing point, and I made a video on this recently on the channel talking about inflation numbers and how it's eating out these three tech giants and what they need to do in these times in order to combat this situation. Basically, in a nutshell, the consumer, that's guys like you and I, we've taken a massive haircut with all the money printing from the Fed, all the reckless spending from governments worldwide, and this is essentially translated into us having less discretionary income at our disposal, or less real income. However, when we look at these 8.3% numbers, people on the streets are saying that they're feeling much higher inflation than 8.3%. Most people would put it in the ballpark of 20 to 40%, which is much more in line with the shadow stats inflation numbers that they post on their website. Furthermore, even if I contrast this to the inflation that I'm feeling here in Japan, they say 3% inflation, but if I go down to my local diner, for example, prices violently rise on certain items on the menu by up to 10% at any given time. Not to mention, it feels like some of the food on the menus is getting smaller over time. So you've got this thing called shrinkflation that doesn't get accounted for in the inflation numbers. And so when it comes to trusting inflation numbers, I'm actually putting my faith more in alternate sources of media that give you real numbers. And so when we look at what I feel is both bogus numbers that are underreported for the consumer on the inflation numbers versus the bogus wage increases of 5.2%, which I feel are overreported for the average consumer, we can see that the average person in society has just been hollowed out in the last 2 years on what their real incomes are, and in turn, what they can spend on things like a graphics card or a monitor or a gaming PC. This has pretty much essentially allowed them to spend less in real terms on these items. Though back to Nvidia and how I feel going forward, they need to start taking a haircut just like the average consumer is taking a massive haircut. I mean, if you look at my hair, I've had to cut it every month. I cut it by myself. I don't go to the hairdresser. So I'm taking haircuts every month. And so the average consumer's having to do the same. And in turn, you would naturally expect Nvidia would have to do the same. And here's where out of the bat with the RTX 4000 series launch is they're not willing to take a haircut. I believe they're passing on all these inflation costs, which are called bill of material costs, onto the end consumer. And the end consumers already, before these graphics cards have come out, they're already livid in the comments section. People are frustrated, especially with this RTX 4080 models, both the $1,199 model up from $799, and then the $899 up from $499. And so these are massive price increases that have come out of Nvidia. And actually, it's really weird that in a podcast that we did a few months ago, I was predicting $2,000 on the 4090, but I was right on the money with the 4080. I thought that would come in at $1,199, and that's exactly where it did. However, on the low side, I was actually a bit surprised to the negative side in that came in the essentially RTX 4070 rebrand that's named an RTX 4080. That's coming in at $899. And so that was coming in a lot higher than I initially thought. Though back to the RTX 4090, and this is a key indicator of what is going on in the tech industry right now. And that is, I believe these inflation costs are much higher than we're all told to believe. Traditionally, these flagship cards haven't been good value. They've been the card that really they don't sell a whole lot of, and the more value-orientated models they sell more of, and they still make good money. That's companies like Nvidia, AMD, and Intel. But this time around, it seems like they're pushing people towards the RTX 4090, making it more of a value play. And that's simply because in the whole process of making a graphics card, all those labor costs, all those shipping costs, all those sourcing of materials, they've all gone up in what I feel is a lot more compared to these CPI costs. And I would just wish that these tech companies like Nvidia would just come clean with this information and just tell the public, look, these inflation costs are absolutely massive. To give you an example of this, we've got the silicon costs on the TSMC 4 nanometer. This is rumored to cost around $16,000 per wafer. And if we contrast that to the Samsung 8 nanometer wafer that was used for the RTX 3000 series, that cost approximately $4,000 per wafer. So you can see here you've had a 4x increase in the costs of the silicon that's being used in these newer GPUs on the 4000 series versus the 3000 series. So another thing associated with this is the Moore's law is clearly not just over, but it's almost like it's working against these tech companies now, where if they want the latest and greatest performance, they've got to really pay for it. And so I feel like Nvidia's paying a lot more for the silicon and then passing that on to the end user. We're going back to those margins that Nvidia and Intel and AMD like to make. Generally in the industry, it's a golden rule that they love to get that 60% margin. Of course, they want to get more, but they've got to compete with one another. So it feels like Nvidia is going for that 60% target, but I feel like they're going to be very disappointed when they don't get the sales volume that they would otherwise be used to with previous graphics card launches. So the final thing I'll say in relation to Nvidia, the RTX 4080 12GB, I wish they would just come clean about it and say that's an RTX 4070. And also, I wish they would just talk about inflation more, get the word out. I wish AMD and Intel as well would get the word out more about inflation and how much the average end user can expect to pay in terms of those materials in those items versus what they used to pay. I just wish we would get some examples here where all we've seen in the financial reports from AMD and Nvidia is mention of macroeconomic conditions being tough. And then on the other hand, Intel seems like they're the only person that's addressed this in the Q2 reports and said inflation's a problem. But I would like to know to what extent and get some numbers here, because basically what you've got at the end of the day is a lot of people that are getting frustrated now with these new launches and the price increases. And myself, I'm getting very frustrated in it because we don't have any concrete data to go by except from what I hear in terms of silicon costs. So if you're taking these costs on, you've got to tell the end user so they know just who the real cause of all these problems are. And that is, as I've been saying for years now, the Federal Reserve and central banks worldwide printing more money, and then governments also taking that printed money and recklessly spending it. But back to Nvidia, here's where they've made two big mistakes, and I wish they would just correct these instead of trying to mislead the public, and that is the 4080 12GB. It's a 4070, and we all know that, and especially with the average consumer, the higher you go up in price, the more research they do. This is documented like history 101 when it comes to marketing. So I'm not sure what they're trying to pull off in relation to the 4080 12GB. I feel like they're just damaging their reputation the more they do this. And then the second point is that I feel Nvidia is trying to pass on a lot of the inflation costs onto the end user, when I feel like in the process, given the economic environment and what I feel it's going to get a lot worse, they're going to have to start absorbing some of these costs, because the end user who's not getting as much money in their real income cannot absorb all these costs either. So there has to be a bit of a compromise here. So I do hope they drop the prices on the 4080 16GB and 4080 12GB, or perhaps rename it a 4070 in turn, and drop the prices. And so I believe that's what's going to have to happen, whether Nvidia likes it or not. Though everything we just said then now applies to AMD. They know this information in advance. They know what the community wants. The community wants these companies essentially now to take a haircut. And what we've got to see with AMD is, with their upcoming RX 7000 series launch, are they going to take that haircut? Are they going to release an RX 7700 XT that performs similar to this RX 4080 12GB, for example, except it comes in at $599? Perhaps it comes in at $649 or even $699. There is an opportunity there for AMD to finally claw back market share if they get this graphics card, the RX 7700 XT, right, and also if they get the RX 7600 XT right. If they can do these two things right, I feel like they can actually claw back market share from Nvidia, and not only that, get much better reputation in the process, which this is going to matter more than it's ever mattered in the past. When it comes to a company's reputation, going through the tough times, people are going to remember things much more clearly than they've remembered them during the good times. I mean, I don't know about you guys, but when I'm off having a partying and having fun, I don't really remember stuff. I mean, might just be because of the alcohol, but generally when you're having a good time, you don't remember really all too well what it's like. But when you're having a really tough time, you generally don't forget those experiences. So AMD does have a golden opportunity here to claw back some of that market share. However, I am going to disclaimer, if you guys are expecting an RX 7600 XT for $250, it's not going to happen. In fact, the inflation costs have it so that you can expect maybe an RX 7600 XT at $399. However, Nvidia is a very tough nut to crack in terms of market share. And the more I research this, the more I realize I believe it has more to do with the Asia Pacific area, where in recent times I've noticed, for instance, in China, the price of RTX 3060s are coming down to extremely low levels. In fact, if we look on AliExpress, you can get a brand new RTX 3060 for just a tad over $300. There's also an RTX 3060 laptop edition, which is being labeled as a desktop. But if we look at the Steam surveys, they are the two top cards that are on the rise in terms of popularity on Steam, which will give you an indication that a lot of people in the Asia region, and specifically China, where these prices are very cheap, these people are adopting these lower price cards. Now, keep in mind also with AliExpress is that these prices are generally inflated 20%, because the seller on AliExpress generally has to pay around 10% shipping costs. They also have to pay 10% fees to the platform itself. So in China, you could expect to see RTX 3060s, even the 12 gig models, going for a little under $250. And that fits right in with that price point of what people are prepared to pay for a mainstream graphics card. So if we look at the prices of the current silicon for the RTX 3000 series, the reason it's going to exist is because it's relatively inexpensive versus the newer silicon, the TSMC real high performance node stuff. And so that in itself is going to enable a different trend that's going to come through the market. And that is, as these silicon costs go up and as all the other costs go up associated with making these newer graphics cards, it's going to pretty much make the older stuff more attractive. For instance, even looking at the RX 580 on AliExpress, that was a card that was released years ago and it's still being made to this date on 14 nanometer. That's because the 14 nanometer costs are very inexpensive now. And so I feel going forward, if you're a gamer, you may wish to look at some of the older generation stuff that's even being produced brand new, because I feel like the costs associated with making those graphics cards is going to be a lot lower to begin with. And also this is going to span from everything, not just the GDDR6X or the newer VRAM that comes out that'll be on smaller nodes, but say the GDDR6, the non-X, that'll be cheaper to produce than the 6X. And so if we relate that back to the RTX 4000 silicon, we can already tell that that silicon costs a lot more for Nvidia to acquire and then pass on to the end user than the 8 nanometer. Now, Nvidia is trying to mitigate this with things like DLSS 3 and adding in RTX Remix. But in terms of those technologies and how much actual value they add for the end user, that's where I'm going to have to test it out and see for myself if these new technologies are going to be really good, or of course, are they just more of a marketing gimmick? And on that last point of DLSS 3, Nvidia, you need to do two things here. Either explain why previous generation 2000 and 3000 users can't use this technology, or make it available for those users. Anyhow, guys, I hope you enjoyed today's video. If you did, then be sure to hit that like button for us, and also let us know in the comment section below what you think about this whole situation regarding Nvidia and regarding what we spoke about in today's video. Do you think that they need to take a haircut and they need to come clean with the public about these costs involved? I feel like they need to do both. And I would like to see tech companies doing this sooner than later, because in my opinion, there's nothing wrong with showing a bit of humility, and people can relate to that much more than I feel they've ever related to that in the past. Though before we move on to the question of the day, the final thing is those AliExpress prices, they are looking very attractive. If you want to buy new graphics cards wherever you live in the world, you can get a really decent price. And for instance, these cards are coming in much cheaper than they are at retailers here in Japan, brand new. And also you can use those prices to know that, hey, in turn, these prices are going to have to come down in my country. And another thing as well, you can gauge those prices and use them to enhance your used hustle on the market. And you can show sellers like, hey, these graphics cards have come down in price. Can I get a better deal off you though for used? And sometimes this strategy can work and you can find yourself getting a great used bargain. Though do keep a lookout on what's already out there on the market, because I feel personally, this is where you're going to be getting the best deals going forward. Anyhow, guys, we got this question of the day here, which comes from Matt Tiaz, and they ask, waiting for a consideration video after you realize what Nvidia really did with this launch after the whoa effect. I hope you check the Nvidia Euro price. Fake 4070 12GB starts from 1109 Euro here and performs worse than the 3090 in the real world. The result here is the secondhand 3080 Ti and 3090 increase a lot in price. I like how people think they are the smarter than one of the best CEOs in the world. PS RTX 4090 is 2K Euro, by the way. So taking a step back from that live stream, I was disappointed with the 4080, both those models. And I was actually surprised by the 4090 and that I thought it would actually cost more than $1,599. However, in terms of what this is going to do to the used market, again, the Chinese market, at least with AliExpress, is offering great prices. So always look as a consumer where you can get the best prices, and don't feel like you're obligated to go out and buy a 4000 series card. If the prices are ridiculous, let the card sit there. And so here at Tech City, I'm going to try and cover all angles, especially when it comes to value products, and giving you guys the best recommendations going forward. Though in terms of taking everything into consideration, hopefully you guys enjoyed the research in today's video, and also putting the ball back in Nvidia's court. They really have to deal with this situation because there's actually quite a few angry people out there. You can go into any comment section and you can notice that people are frustrated. And that's mainly due to the economic conditions that exist. And Nvidia needs to understand that and then adjust accordingly, in that they've got to take that haircut. Anyhow, I hope that answers that question. I'll catch you guys in another tech video very soon. If you've enjoyed the content, you've stayed this far, and you want to see the techiest content as soon as it drops, be sure to hit that sub button, ring that bell, and I'll see you next time. Peace out for now. Bye.